Okay, I think we can start. Good afternoon to everybody. Just a few words about the Merloni Foundation, which is organizing this lecture. The Merloni Foundation, for those of you, there are some of you who don't know about the Merloni Foundation, was founded more than 50 years ago in 1963 by Aristide Merloni, who is the father of the Merloni industries in Fabriano. You may have heard of this name, or Indesit, or Ariston as the main labels of the Merloni products. The mission of the foundation from the very beginning was the promotion of entrepreneurial culture. And at the beginning, this mission was accomplished also by directly financing new firms in the Fabriano territory. During the 70s, the mission remained the same, but the way to accomplish it changed. And from that time, the Merloni Foundation basically sustained and financed research on local development, and especially looking at the specific way of industrialization of the Marche region and of some part of Italy, which you know is famous for the presence of small and medium-sized firms and industrial districts. So it's basically studying how these systems work. And in the 70s, also the journal Economia Marche was founded to publish the results of this research. And it also started this tradition of inviting a professor or researcher for a lecture named after the journal Economia Marche. Not just about the themes of the lecture. You have the list of all the lectures. This is the 13th. Are not just about local development, but also about macroeconomic themes, like the theme of this lecture. Because Andrea Presbytere, that with me and Marco Cuculelli joined the direction of the journal, is much more titled than me in talking about macroeconomics and especially banking and the money system. So I leave to Andrea to present Professor Wyplosz. I hope I pronounced well the surname. And I thank you for inviting our request. But before the presentation of Professor Wyplosz, I ask Sabrina for just a welcome from his staff.
Okay, thank you, Donato. And I'm here on behalf of the General Director, Giuliano Calza, and just to welcome all of you here, to thank the Professor Wyplosz for this lecture, to thank the Fondazione Merloni for this opportunity, and I hope you will enjoy it. I just want to welcome the course in tourism and the Ohio students. They come from very long way, very distant, so we are very happy to have you here. Enjoy.
Good afternoon to everybody. I just take no more than 2 minutes to introduce Charles Wyplosz. As probably everybody said to you, there is no need for an introduction, but still, just let me remind a few things. Charles is Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and is also the Director of the International Center of Money and Banking Studies. I have to say that I am quite honored to introduce you, since he is the author of a very well-known and established textbook in macroeconomics, and it is the one I've studied with when I started studying economics as my undergraduate. I remember those days. In those days, probably I was not loving you that much, in the sense that it's a very tough book. But you see the rewards years after, since that I remember it was much harder. It was much more it was huge, and a lot of pages that, as a student, you start evaluating and assessing books in terms of pages, and it was a very high book. But still, you know, then when you grow up, you realize that it is a very nice book, and it also authored also a well-established book in economic integration, which is very close to his research team and research areas. Professor Wyplosz has published a lot in a number of prestigious academic journals. He's published book, chapters in book, and on a number of themes which are ranges from monetary policy to fiscal policy, and a lot also on economic integration, especially in Europe, but also on financial issues, especially banking and international banking and financial crisis. So I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to learn from him about what is happening, unfortunately, for more than 5 years right now during the crisis all over the world, especially in Europe. I have to say that among the many contributions that Charles has produced in the past years, I think he is really an expert in issues related to debt and debt sustainability, which are also extremely related to what I did. And I remember a very nice paper he have written a few years ago, right now, on debt sustainability, and the title was very nice because he calls it something like Mission Impossible. It's very difficult to assess that sustainability, and we probably read a lot on newspapers or in academic publication or in books about what is that sustainability, and it seems something we can take it for granted for some kind of formula, looking at the data, while it's a very controversial issue, and it's very difficult to assess that sustainability. It's a very relevant topic so far, and as you can see from the title of the slides, Charles Wyplosz is an author of what is called PADRE plan, which is a politically acceptable debt restructuring in the Eurozone, and it's a very nice and challenging proposal on how to restructure public debt in the Eurozone. And as I was saying, the topic is very timely. For instance, the IMF recently released another policy paper with a different plan, more about, still about debt restructuring and debt reprofiling. So it would be good to hear from Charles about that. Anyway, the topic of today's presentation is about the mismanagement or the perfect mismanagement of the crisis, and we are very happy that Charles can talk about that. So the title of the presentation is not exactly what you see there, but since Professor Wyplosz has been asked to provide some new ideas, and some new contribution also for Economia Marche, our journal, he was so kind that he moved and tried to present now something new, given that we are talking about something that changed day after day. We are very honored that you take your time to now discuss something which is new, and we also would be very interested also to listen about the plan and more generally about the crisis in Europe. So without further ado, I will give you the floor for, I think in terms of organization, we have all the time you want, but remember at some point there will be a dinner, so.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for this nice presentation. Thank you for the invitation, especially to the Foundation Merloni. I'm very honored. The list of speakers that have come here is particularly impressive, and I'm impressed to be here. I'm wondering what I am doing here. Anyway, thanks, Andrea, for saying the nice things about the textbook. I must say, that's one of the moving things, is to see people who learn from the textbook complain about difficulties, but it's very moving. That was the idea of having people discover macroeconomics through our writing with my co-author, so that's very nice. Now, on the topic, since I've been asked to produce a paper for the Economia Marche, and the PADRE paper is being published, I thought I had to do something completely new, and I have done something completely new. But when I arrived here, everybody seems to be interested in talking about Padre. So I have a presentation, I have a paper, I will take you through that. It is, of course, deeply relevant to Padre. And I'll take a few minutes at the end to generally present the proposal, and then we'll have questions and answers if you want. I'll try to economize on the time I spend speaking, so we can have exchanges and discuss various aspects of what I'm going to say. Now, what I'm going to say, it's basically the result of several years, 3-4 years of deep frustration with the zone, the crisis we have in the Eurozone. I've seen basically week after week policy leaders making decisions, and I felt that the decisions were wrong and wrong and wrong, and indeed things have gotten worse and worse. So when I was invited to write a paper, I said maybe it's the time to complain, because things have improved, because at the end some correct decisions are going to have been taken. So what I'm going to present is not a blow-by-blow description of the crisis, but I will take a number of themes and see why I think the policymakers got it wrong. And I think the crisis should have never happened, by the way. And it should not have happened if things had been done long ago, right? And things which, by the way, have been all described in the literature. Most of the problems we have discovered since the beginning of the crisis have been described carefully with policy proposal in the academic literature. So when policymakers tell me, you academics, you don't know what you're talking about, I think the policymakers don't know what they're talking about. And I'll try to prove that. It's easier to be done in a university, of course, than in government circles, but I'm okay. Now, first, and I'll go very fast on that because I want to keep room for Padre, there's not even agreement about the reason for the crisis, and there are two popular stories which are sometimes put together, saying a number of people will say, well, we have a crisis either because we had these large current account imbalances, so there was a big literature before that, which I think has been disproved, but it's still alive and well, and there is all this. It's basically an assessment where people say, oh yes, we have a crisis because the Southern European countries are not competitive. Now, I and others have written papers showing that both of these things are wrong. And what I think is that we have a debt crisis because we had too high debts, period. And why try to look at something else than look at what really drove the crisis and what is the story? On top of that, looking at the public debt can be helpful to understand why there may have been current account imbalances and why there may have been, for a while, competitiveness problems. And essentially, governments were spending too much, and that put pressure on the current account to go to deficit, and that put pressure on domestic prices to rise. And the problem, there's a confusion between symptoms and causes. I won't spend much time here, again, in order to save it's not central to what I have to say. What I have here is public debt in the original 12 Eurozone countries, counting Greece as an original. They came 2 years late, but I count them as original. You have in dark blue, in blue, the public debt in 1970 as a percentage of GDP. In green, the public debt just before the crisis in 2007, before the financial crisis, and 2013, the last debt. And all you have to see is that virtually every country, certainly all the countries which have been in crisis, have had a very strong increase in the public debt between 1970 and 2007. So if they had been fiscally disciplined, they would be in the blue position on the eve of the crisis, and there would have been no crisis. It's already a mistake that goes back decades. A large number of countries have not yet seen any balanced budget for about 40 years. So 2 generations of people. That's certainly the case in my country, France. The last time there was a budget balance in France was 1974. So it's basically 2 generations of people who have lived in a country where the normal thing is to run budget deficit. Now, if you think it's normal, then at some point something abnormal has to happen, like a crisis, and it is what happened. And the figure shows also that the debts have increased tremendously during the crisis, and I'll get back to that. That's about Padre. Okay, now let me focus a little bit on Greece, because Greece was the first country to get into crisis, and that's where all the bad mistakes were done. Everything was done there in basically in a few weeks leading to May 2010. They managed to pack up all the mistakes, and that's why the crisis has continued, and that's what I'm going to argue. Now, first thing I would like to do is a little bit of theory and remind you, if need be, about the phenomenon of multiple equilibria, sometimes linked to the principle of self-fulfilling prophecies, which is a fundamental characteristic of financial markets. Financial markets base every decision of what they think will happen in the future. Since the future is infinitely wide, the financial markets can imagine everything. And if they imagine good things, well, good things happen. If the financial markets imagine disasters, well, they panic. If you imagine there is a disaster going to happen, you panic, and the disaster happened right now. Now, that's a fundamental characteristic of financial markets, and you cannot have a financial market without this phenomenon of multiple equilibria. And when you live in such a world, you have to be ready for it. And we haven't been ready for it, and when it happened, you have to recognize that it's happening, and the policymakers didn't recognize. So all I wanted to do is to remind you there is a very fundamental phenomenon which is based on the fact that markets think ahead, in contrast to politicians, and they can imagine virtually anything, and whatever they imagine has a tendency of happening immediately. That's why we talk about self-fulfilling prophecies. I hope it's clear. I don't want to go into theory or formal developments. I hope the concept is very intuitive. Now, here I show the interest rate on Greek bonds measured as difference between Greek bond interest rates and German interest rates. So it's just to take out German interest rates are safe. German bonds are considered as safe, although they might not be the case forever, but at least through the period they have been considered as safe. So this is the risk premium on Greek bonds. I go back to 2007 to show the phenomenon of multiple equilibria. So if you look 2007 to 2008, the spreads were extremely small, much less than a percentage point. The scale, by the way, is basis points. So the top 3,000, it's 30%. So if you get there, it means the interest rate on Greek bonds is 30% above the interest rate, 30% per year. It's 30% above the German bonds. Now, basically, ever since Greece joined the euro area, the spread was never more than 50 basis points. For Italy, it was 15, 20 basis points, so percentage of percent. And a number of people say, oh, the markets were crazy. They didn't realize Greece was going to be, the Greek debt was unsustainable, the point that Andrea made. And that's why I think unsustainable, it doesn't make sense because, well, let me just say why. Well, what happened is, and I remember many of us were discussing the things, why the spread so little on Greece? And the usual answer that I bought and I still buy today was, do we believe that Greece is going to default? Do we believe that Greece is going to leave the euro area? And the answer was no. And in the world at that time, it was a perfectly logical answer. There was a tiny, tiny probability that Greece would default. And that explained why the spread was not zero. But since the probability was low, the spread was extremely low. Now, what happened is that some bad things happened during 2009 following the financial crisis, and I'll show that in a minute. And the markets say, hey, wait a minute, maybe Greece can default. And then the interest rate spread showed up. It's not that the markets were crazy, but in the world before 2008, it made sense to assume that it will not default. We don't know what the future will be, but it was the most reasonable thing to accept. Then a new equilibrium occurred during 2009, and the markets say, well, could default. And the more things went through, and I'll be more specific in a second, the more the markets say, well, the probability of default is certainly bigger than we thought last month, but it's not that they were wrong, that's things were happening that were explaining that. So the equilibria changed, and it changed, and it changed, and it got worse and worse. The vertical line is the saving of Greece in May 2010. So that says when the government came and say, we've taken care of Greece, next topic. That was just the beginning, so there were new bad equilibria that came after. Now, you can see there is a peak towards the middle of 2012. That's where, so between 2009 and 2012, markets got increasingly pessimistic about Greece, or multiple equilibria were getting worse. Equilibria were getting worse one after the other. And then something miraculous happened in 2012. And some of you may know the answer. If you don't, I'm going to keep you waiting and tell you, but there was a change that's moved the equilibrium for a bad equilibrium to a much better one. And it's still happening now when you see the crisis is getting less acute. It's still pretty bad, but it's less acute. Okay? Now, having explained that, what really happened in 2009? Well, 2009 is the year of the world depression following the great financial crisis, Lehman Brothers and all of that. And every country, well, certainly in the developed world and many emerging market countries, went into a recession in 2009. And that was the case of Greece. So the dark line, the black line, shows the GDP growth rate. So by 2007, Greece was doing pretty well, growing at nearly 4% per year. It was totally reasonable to assume that they will not default on their public debt. So that was the previous equilibrium. And then things go down and down and down. And you can see that by 2009, the growth rate in Greece is minus 3.5%. The red line is the budget. Now, the Greeks were not good at fiscal discipline before the crisis, so there was a deficit to start with. Greece is actually one of the countries that never had. The last budget balance in Greece actually happened under the dictatorship of the colonels in the early 70s. Since then, no Greek government has even cared to have a balanced budget. So they were not in balance in 2007. They had a small deficit of 1%, which is still much too big. And what happened is that the economy went into a recession, the deficit became bigger and bigger and bigger. So the market spotted that, and they say, wow, Greece is particularly hurt by the financial crisis. Why is that? It's not a financial center of the world, and their deficit is going wrong. And then what happened is an amazing thing, is that there were elections at the end of 2009, and the new government thought they would be smart. They said, they say we are going to reveal to the world that the previous government was hiding the true magnitude of the budget deficit. So the number is much worse than you thought. It's not on us, it's on the previous guys. What the markets heard was there is a bad situation in Greece, and we can't believe the Greek numbers, and they are likely to be much worse. That was panic. That's essentially at that stage that we shift virtually overnight from a reasonably good equilibrium to a bad equilibrium, where markets say we don't trust any Greek number, we don't trust any Greek government, we trust nothing that's Greek, let's get out of it. And that was the shift to a new equilibrium. So the markets grew enormously worried. The question is, what were the options? What could be done? Well, one obvious solution, which I was defending at the time, was there is something called the IMF. Andrea knows about that place. Their job is to deal with countries like that cannot borrow from markets anymore, and they still have deficits to finance. So why doesn't Greece go to the IMF? That was one solution. Now, the answer was no. There's a famous speech by the president of the ECB saying, we do our dirty cleaning in-house. We don't have the others wash up our dirty laundry. Very smart. So, can do that. The next idea was to say, well, the debt in Greece is so high that they would help to default. You can do it better than Argentina. Greece should default. Of course, our friends at the ECB gave another speech and say, no, default is good for emerging countries, it's good for Latin American. We Europeans are not that kind. We don't default. The third option was help Greece. So all the governments should get together and do something for Greece. But in the treaties, in the Treaty of European Monetary Union, we have something called the no bailout clause that says neither governments nor the central bank can lend to a country to plug its budgetary problem. So that was the only three solutions open. None of them was available. The treaty was saying no to the bailout, and the central bank was saying no to the others. So what happened? You have markets panicking at one end, starting to get really worried. At the other hand, policymakers who say we don't do anything essentially, or we don't accept anything that looks like the solution. They essentially eliminate all the solution. So what happened next? Of course, that was it. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, when the dust settled, the IMF was called in. So we said no, but we called them in a few weeks later. Not very smart. We said we have a treaty says no bailout. May 2010 is a bailout of Greece, so a violation of the treaty. And we said no default, never any default. It's only good for Argentinians. And of course, a year later, there was a default. So the three things that could have been done, one of the three, or two of the three, or all three of them could have been done in good time, were rejected. That led to the crisis, and all three things were done later. That is getting me very furious, and I hope you are furious as well. Okay. Now, that was just the beginning. Now, let me listen to what I consider as the 7 cardinal mistakes of policymakers. First, Greece. The statement was, this is unique and exceptional, so the May 2010 bailout of Greece is something that will not be repeated anywhere else because the case of Greece is unique. Of course, they created a precedent, and when a few months later Ireland got into trouble, the Irish could say, why don't we get the same treatment as Greece? Okay, so the Irish got the same treatment, same mistakes, same treatment. Then a few months later, the Portuguese got into trouble, and guess what? They got the Greek treatment. There were little institutional changes, but basically the architecture was set for Greece in May 2010. It was a precedent, and as we all know, when you create a powerful precedent, you can't avoid it. So all the mistakes they did in May 2010 for Greece became engraved in stones as the law of the land, as the law of the monetary union. First mistake. So they thought they were doing something exceptional, but they didn't realize it wasn't. Second, they created something very strange that you may have heard about, which is the Troika. The Troika brings together the IMF, the European Commission, and the ECB, and they do the IMF work of going from country to country in trouble and say, we are going to lend you money, but in exchange you have to promise to do all these very, very unpleasant things. Essentially austerity, cutting wages, firing civil servants. That's what the IMF has been invented for. That's what it's being blamed for. But now we have this system where the IMF is the junior partner in the Troika. The head is the European Commission. Now, this is a terribly bad idea for the IMF. The IMF has always refused to do that. They were asked to do that in the Asian crisis. This time, for reasons that I don't even want to mention, because it involved a Frenchman, the IMF did this mistake. It was also a mistake for the European Commission, because when the IMF does bad things to a country, for good reasons, or at least with good intentions. When it's over, it's over. The IMF goes away, and for the next 2 generations, when the mothers want to yell at their kids, they call the kids IMF, bad, bad, bad kids, you are IMF people. But the IMF is gone. The problem is the European Commission is the bad, bad, bad cop. And the European Commission is not going to be away from Europe. So the risk is that countries will not want to be in Europe. So that was a very silly mistake. Third, the treaties say no bailout. May 2010, we do a bailout. And the no bailout clause, I think, is the only good thing we had to ensure fiscal discipline in Europe. I can talk more about that. But now that we have violated a piece of treaty, the first time it was binding, it's very hard to make it happen again. So it's another precedent. We promise we'll never drink, and the first time we offer a glass, we drink. What is the value of this promise? 0. So we've lost a very important piece of the treaty. Fourth, that was pitiful. When early 2010 they finally started to say about helping out Greece, there was a famous summit meeting where they said, we are going to provide Greece with 10 billion euros of help. Everybody started to laugh, including me. So the next week, or the 10 days or 3 weeks later, they said, not 10, 20. Well, the first package of May 2010 was 110 billion. In 2 years later, there was another package of 130 billion, and we are still talking about the third package. So you can see that the amounts that they had in mind were clearly out of line with any reality. And that's the multiple equilibrium aspect of things. You think you have a little crisis in Greece. No, it's a big crisis. It's much bigger than you think. Worse, if you talk about 10 billion when the market expects hundreds of billion, you get the markets even more panicked. And I remember talking to market people at that time, and they said 10 billion. They don't know, they don't understand what's happening. And if they don't understand what's happening, how can they do anything good? So that increased actually the panic mode in the market, and that worsened the equilibrium. More, as I don't think I have to insist very much in this country, they imposed, when the Troika came, they imposed austerity in country after country. So we had countries in deep recession, and they asked to have austerity policies, which means having fiscal policy becoming more restrictive. Now, many of us scream and say, you don't do that at this stage. The IMF has tried to do that and has been doing that, but very often realized they had to go very soft and very careful. Here, the European Commission went all gang on with strong austerity policies. And when they were told, look, you're going to worsen the recession, and if the recession gets worse, the budget deficits will become worse, the answer was, there is no link between austerity policies and growth. So it was the whole debate you may have heard about the multipliers, the fiscal multiplier. The Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs of the European Commission came out saying multipliers makes no sense, it's not the real world, it's not the way it happened. Well, there are multipliers, and essentially what they did was completely misunderstanding what's happening. Here you have the same picture as before, in dark the growth rates, in red the budget balance. What I've added in dotted line is the forecast of the European Commission at the end of 2010. It's in October 2010. So in May 2010 they had this plan, and then they produced a forecast of what the plan would lead. Well, if you look at the growth rate, the dark line, you can see that the Commission in 2010 first misread the growth rate in 2009 and 2010. It was worse than they thought. And that's not their fault. It's hard to collect data. But they were sure that by 2011, the negative growth rate would become smaller. And they were sure, at least that's what they published, that Greece would be growing in 2012. That's the black line that goes up. Now, the dark line tells you the truth, and you can see that they completely, and I believe intentionally, underestimated the recession that was happening and the recession that they were creating with their austerity policies. And the red line shows the evolution of the budget. So you can see that in the middle of recession, the budget is becoming less negative. That's austerity, austerity. And you can see that the dotted line is above the other one. So they were thinking it would be much better than what happened next. So the key element of the package of the Troika was based on the idea that austerity doesn't bring recession, and it led them to make this reasonably disappointing forecast, which is an indication that they didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't know what was going to happen, or pretended they didn't know. 6, next to the end, close to the end, when they did Greece, they said, and when they did the bailout, even though they shouldn't do it, they say, well, we have a good reason to do that. They denied, of course, they were violating the treaty, but they said, even if we do things that don't look exactly like the orthodox thing to do, we do it for a good reason. We don't want the Greek crisis to spread. We don't want contagion. Guess what happened? Contagion. So they thought, at least in their public statements, that with the Greek package they had stopped the crisis. That's what they thought. Of course, we know it didn't stop, so that was, again, the mistake. They didn't plan for the next one. They were not ready for Portugal. They were not ready for Greece. They were not ready for anything else because they didn't think it would happen. They were not preparing for that. Now, here, just a little picture on the contagion. You have the spreads that I showed you before. I stopped in 2011 because they become too big, but you have the spread of various countries. I don't want to spend too much time. The vertical line is the Greek package, the idea that once we show how strong we are and determined we are, the markets will understand they are talking to real people and there will be no more crisis. And you can see that's essentially when everything went wrong. And it went wrong because the markets concluded that the governments, the policymakers didn't know what they were doing. And finally, well, I talked about that. Sending the Troika rather than the IMF is not a good idea because it leaves a deep, bad impression of what Europe is about. It turns the European Commission as the villain of the story. I said that. I shouldn't have developed it. The second one was a mistake for the IMF. The last one was a mistake for the Commission. All right. Moving forward, after May 2010 to end 2011, there were crisis after crisis. It spread. Spain got into trouble. There was a time when Italy was on the brink, and people were starting to look at France, so things were wrong. Now, you may remember at that time, there was a summit of our beloved leaders virtually every month. And every summit was saying two things. The situation is very dangerous, very serious, but we have a solution. And that's the last summit we need to meet to solve the problem solved. Well, they weren't solving. I went through all the declarations of the summits, and what do they talk about? They talk about the Stability and Growth Pact. They say the problem was there was not fiscal discipline, correct. The reason why we had no fiscal discipline was because the Stability and Growth Pact was not strong enough, wrong. I don't want to talk too much about that, but that's dear to my heart. It doesn't work, it hasn't worked, it will not work for one simple reason. Is the Stability Pact assumed that the Commission or the Council of Ministers can tell a country, do this, do that. But every member country of the euro area is completely sovereign in terms of fiscal policy. So you can't tell the Italian parliament what to do. That's just impossible. And that's why the pact has never worked and didn't work. And I can talk for 2 hours about that, but I won't. And this belief that strengthening the Stability Pact would quiet down the market. So during this period, you saw before the picture, the spreads were going up and up and up. So the heads of states and government would meet and say, we have to do something to stop the panic of the market. So their main idea was to say, we're strong on the Stability and Growth Pact, which did not impress at all the market. The markets were worried about the recession. They were worried about no growth. That's what they were worried about. Next, what they did during that period was to create the EFSF, so all this acronym, the European Financial Stability Fund, which was designed to lend money. to Greece and to other governments later on. And then initially the FSF was supposed to last just a few, 2 or 3 years and be closed. Why? Because we're going to solve the crisis in no time. When the crisis started to become longer and deeper, they transformed the FSF into the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, which is to exist forever. So this shifted for just a few months to forever, and they created the ESM. Now, the maximum lending capacity of the ESM is 500 billion, and all governments, leaders came around and had their mouth full, 500 million we can put on the table. The markets were not impressed, because they added up the debt numbers of Greece, plus Portugal, plus Ireland, and Spain doesn't look good, and Italy may be dangerous. That already came to 3,000 billion. Add France, and you are at 4,500 billion. So when the governments come with 500, and the markets worry about 3,000 or 4,000 billion, that can't impress them. And the risk premia kept going on and on and on, because the market said one more time they don't know what we are worried about. And the ECB was also the same, doing small moves or wrong moves and increasing market despair. Here, I'll probably just pass on to it. You have the interest rates in dark of the ECB. In blue, it's the Federal Reserve, and in red, it's the Federal Reserve interest rate, the US, and in blue, it's the Bank of England. Slow, the central bank was slow, and you can see that even in 2011, they were raising the interest rate. You know what? During the whole crisis, the ECB was worried, this period, the ECB was worried about inflation, not recession, not unemployment. And they thought there was a bit of inflation coming in 2011 when the economy was plunging, and they raised the interest rate. Well, they had to cancel that later on. The second figure shows the size of the balance sheets, the amount of money put in the market. It's normalized to be 100 in the US, in Europe, and in the UK in January 2007. The dark line is the ECB. They've done half of the job, or not even half of the job of the other major central banks. So they were not really worrying about the recession and the crisis. They were worried about inflation more than anything else. Now, thanks God, and I'm coming to the end, if by now you're depressed and furious, welcome. But there have been some good news lately, and the good news is that we've changed our management at the ECB. Of course, you know the name of the new president of the ECB, a good Italian fellow, but it's not just the president, it's almost the whole leadership has changed. And then suddenly things have started to look good. So it's my next point, is when you have good people running important institutions, they stop making the mistakes of the previous one, to be very explicit. So what happened? Well, Mario and his friend started at the end of 2011 with the so-called LTRO. So they create this acronym. It's really a pain to be in this field. LTRO is long-term refinancing operations, where essentially they started to put on the table amounts of money that looks like they resemble something. So in two go, in the end of 2011 and in March and early 2012, the ECB put on the table 1 billion euros. That's twice the lending capacity of the ESM. Just the 6 guys sitting in Frankfurt, they did that. Well, the markets were impressed. They said, well, that's, you know, we are not talking ESM kind of operations, we're talking about the central bank moving. But they were not fully reassured because there was a new management. So what happened, well, you may remember in the summer of 2012, July, I think, our friend Mario went to the Olympic Games in London, and he had these 3 words, whatever it takes, we'll do. And that was impressive, because essentially he was saying, we at the ECB is ready to put any amount of money to bring these interest rates up. This big premium I showed you, which was showing the total disaster. He said, well, we're going to give, essentially to buy public bonds enough to fully reassure the markets. And we don't know what it is. So it's not 500, it's not 1 billion, it's whatever it takes. The markets were very impressed. And that was the end of the crisis. Now, I have a little bit of criticism even on that, but I won't dwell on that. I will just say, after 3 years, finally, some people understood that when you have financial markets panicking, you have to tell them, we're going to do whatever it takes to stabilize prices, to prevent bonds from collapsing or to prevent interest rates from going up. People in finance know these two things work in the opposite direction. And that was it. That was the end of the beginning of the end of the crisis, although I'm going to say it's not the end. So I come to the end of this part of my talk before I talk about Padre. The next mistake. I put here again for all the member countries now, the 22 countries of the euro area, the public debt as percentage of GDP. In green, it's the situation in 2009 on the eve of the sovereign debt crisis, and the red is the addition. The news here, the important news here is in every single country, public debts have gone up since the crisis started. Now, I've been arguing before, we had a debt crisis in the euro area because public debts were too high. So the green bars is what brought us with the crisis. The green bars are already much too high. And the current situation, these are forecasts of the European Commission for the end of this year. The current situation is worse than before the crisis. So if you think, as I do, that the crisis occurred because debts were too high, then the conclusion is that we are in an even worse situation. And if you think in multiple equilibrium terms and say, well, right now we have Mario and friends doing very nice things, not perfect things, but very nice things. They haven't been tested yet, but they seem to be resolute. But still, if you're the market, you think the problem remains not only intact, but worse than it was before. And that's where I am going to end up today, saying we are in an extremely dangerous situation. For the time, the markets have moved from a terrible equilibrium to a medium equilibrium where they don't think that the debt crisis, that default is imminent. So the probability of default is going down, but it's certainly not going down to zero. The risk premia are certainly not zero, and the situation is as dangerous, in fact more dangerous than before. So that's where I wanted to end up this presentation, but that leads me to Padre. So if I can say just 5 minutes about Padre. So looking at that with a colleague, a banker who knows these things better than I do, did Pierre Paris, we thought, well, we looked at these numbers and we said, very dangerous situation. We can't go on like that forever. It can blow up again, and we don't want to see any more of this crisis for many reasons, because we are in a much more fragile position now. So can we do something about this public debt? Now, the official approach to this high public debt, of course, everybody can see them. If you talk to the Commission or to the IMF, the official line, Plan A, is fiscal discipline, run budget surpluses. I've looked at, if you take the average debt in the euro area, which is something like 100%, and you say, how many years will it take to bring it down to 60%, which is supposed to be the norm? If you follow the fiscal compact that was agreed upon during this period, this fiscal compact says that any country that has a debt above 60% has to reduce it by 0.5 percentage point of GDP every year. Every year. That's what we all agreed upon. You signed for that, whether you know it or not. If you apply this formula, which I think is a bit ambitious, it will take 35 years to bring the average public debt in the euro area from 100% to 60. Now, if you look at Greece or Italy or Portugal, I mean the countries on the right, it's not 35 years, it's 50, 60, 70 years. Which means the Plan A, the official plan, is to remain in this precarious situation where a multiple equilibrium can shift the economy in the bad situation any time for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think that's the next mistake, and that's why we've been trying to think about Plan B. Plan B is politically acceptable debt restructuring in the Eurozone, Padre. It's a well-known Spanish word, as you know. And it's not only Spanish. Now, how is Padre working? I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can. I don't have a slide to support the presentation, but essentially the way it works is the following. There is an agency which, don't worry what it is, a European agency that goes out on the markets and buys half of all the public debt, half of all of that. All the euro area debt country, they buy debt, they buy it gradually whenever a debt is coming for refloating because it's maturing, then the agency comes and buys it. And it buys at the market price, which upon maturity means there is no loss to anyone. So this agency will take a few years to acquire half of the public debt. Current numbers, it would be 4,700 billion euros. It's a lot of money. So this agency buys the debt, and what it does next, it essentially writes it down. I am not going to go into detail, but it tells the governments, you have this debt, but don't worry, it doesn't exist anymore. So the bars that you have here are all reduced by about half, which means the highest debt in the euro area would be Greece, something a bit around 100% of GDP. Not fine, Greece would probably need more, but for Italy it would be down to below 80%, if I remember the numbers. So that removes from the marketplace this extremely dangerous situation. It brings down the probability of a bad equilibrium occurring because of public debt very significantly. If you do what I'm proposing to do, the crisis is more or less over. Now, the problem is that this agency that buys the debt and then erases it has to find money. You don't buy 4,700 billion like that. So the agency goes on the market and it borrows, big borrowing. Now, if you think about what the agency is doing, it's borrowing and pay interest rate on its borrowing, and it owns the exact same amount of money of public debt from government, but it doesn't want to be paid. So the agency is making a loss. Every day, every month, every year, the agency is paying its interest on its own borrowing and getting nothing on the government bond that it holds. So the agency is bankrupt. Now, here comes the next idea. Every government that's part of the plan, which in my mind is all the governments, receive money from the central bank. That's called seigniorage. As you know, if you're a central banker, you can print paper money legally. And it's very, very nice if you ever try to do it when you were a kid, you write some number on the banknote and you go to your parents and you say, here is 10 euros, give me candies or chocolate or whatever. That's very nice. That's what central banks do legally, and it's a lot of money. And the nice thing is that we all need paper money, so for the next infinity of time, we are likely to want to have these nice little papers in our wallets or bags, which represent a lot of profit for the central bank. Now, the rule in every country between the euro is that the central bank, the ECB, sends back its profits to its member government through the national central banks, but all governments receive these profits. The last step of the Padre plan is where each government writes to the ECB and say, don't send this money to me, send it to the agency. And if I do the computation, if you wait long enough, this seigniorage money is enough to cover 4,700 billion. So now I have solved the crisis. How did I solve the crisis? I eliminated from the marketplace half of this public debt, and every government is going to pay for it because the governments have given up a nice source of income, which is called seigniorage. It's one of the safest source of income you can think on earth, because it's a really good business. It's better than Google or Microsoft. It works really well as a source of income. So that's the solution. The crisis is over. Now, why is it politically acceptable? It is politically acceptable because nobody's hurt. So it's not like a default when Argentina tells its lenders, goodbye, I'm not paying anything. In this case, all the bonds are bought at market price by the agency. So nobody is hurt, and then very importantly, banks are not destroyed, which would be the case with a default. Number two, each country, one by one, is going to pay for its debt. So there is no transfer from one country to another. As you know, the Germans are adamant. They don't want to pay for the Italian debt, or they don't want to pay for the Greek debt. And that's 99% of the German voters support this view, so it's not going to go away, and there will be no Eurobonds or any of these things that people love in Italy because the Germans don't want to pay for the debt. In my plan, in the Padre plan, nobody pays for another debt. Italy is going to have half of its debt reduced, and is going to pay back through having given up the profit that it will receive for a very long period of time from the ECB. So there is no transfer across countries. There is no inflation created by that because the ECB is not printing money to pay for the debt. The ECB just carries out its normal business, except that at the end of the year, when they send a check of their profits to member countries, instead of writing the Central Bank of Italy that then passes on the Treasury, they write the agency, whatever the agency is. So it doesn't affect monetary policy. There is no reason for that to be inflationary. It doesn't affect the independence. And that's why I call it politically acceptable. And that's the answer to this problem. Now, coming to an end, conclusion. So that was the Padre bracket. I'm just going to mention that it's late. We need to keep space. What went wrong? Well, the Stability Pact is the wrong concept of fiscal discipline. I already mentioned it. The only good thing we had was the no bailout clause, and now it's been lost. Number two, we didn't have in the euro area a procedure for the central bank to be a lender of last resort to banks. And it could not do because it had no control on banks. It was done at the national level. This is why, and that's a creation of the ECB, we have a banking union. What happened is one day, our friend Mario made a speech and he says, I have a lot of money to solve the crisis, but before I do that, I'd need a banking union. Within weeks, political leaders said, yes, we're going to do a political union. Then they backpedaled. Same with, well, there was a master coup by the ECB. They essentially forced governments to deal with the absent banking union. It was a mistake that many of us had written about. So now possibly we'll have a land of last resort, but the banking union is not well done. So that's why I call it 1.0, because it needs to be improved. And then let me close on a political note. The governance of the crisis has been absolutely terrible. As you know, there has been a debate about do we have the community method where the Commission makes the proposals and the governments follow the proposals, or we have the intergovernmentalism where it's the heads of states or the ministers that get together and agree on solution. And since the Treaty of Rome, there has been tensions within Europe whether we should do one procedure or the other. In the end, we do both, and now we have the European Parliament. What happened during the crisis, the European Commission had exactly zero idea from day one. So the community method was not even tried. And what happened, it was intergovernmentalism reduced to one government. It's essentially German leadership for reasons that we can discuss, but the crisis has been managed by one country. And that's not good. That's not what we wanted. Plus, it's normal that this country defends its own interest. I'm not blaming them for defending their interest. German voters vote for a chancellor that's going to defend their interest, not for a chancellor that's going to run the European affairs. So something deeply wrong happened. The power that got concentrated in the hands of the German chancellor is totally abnormal. It's not her fault. It's our collective fault. We don't have the right system of governance at the European Union. And that's one of the very, very damaging things we had, and one of the explanations why things went so wrong. So I'm going to stop here. I tried to package a little bit Padre inside my talk, and of course I'm delighted to discuss if people want to argue or disagree. Hopefully people will want to disagree.
Thank you very much. It's been a very nice and challenging and provoking lecture. I would have a number of questions, but I would love the floor to start with. I think if it's okay with you, maybe we can collect a bunch of questions and then you reply and then we iterate a few other times. So Was. Is there a mic? Is there?
Yeah, I'm interested in the current solution. Could there be an unintended consequence of the current solution? In other words, if countries know their debt is being written down systematically, would that encourage countries to incur more debt so that it would be written down even further?
What about, according to you, in the framework of debt consolidation and fiscal discipline, if you can imagine an effective role of fiscal rule, what do you think of the role of fiscal rule in this context in order to stabilize and maybe make more accountable government in relation to debt situation? Thank you.
Sorry, could you underline the relation between banks, French bank, German banks, and UK banks in this kind of a vision that you have presented today? I mean that markets image, but markets is composed by individuals. And in this way, the interest of European banks filled by Greek bonds, Italian bonds, decided to finance this country, at the end they are obliged to buy their bonds, you know? And this way there is a contrast in this kind of analysis. I mean that the banks' interests are much more heavy with the political and the social and the domestic interest. Thank you.
I wonder if you have considered to use the gold reserves instead of seigniorage for financing your agency.
I think if you maybe you can reply and then we. Or there is a question? Okay.
I would just like you to clarify the no bailout, your opinion on the no bailout, looking back at the American financial collapse, where Lehman Brothers ended up going bankrupt and AIG was in turmoil. A bailout worked as far as the TARP bill with Hank Paulson and Timothy Geithner. So I'm just not sure why you didn't think a bailout would work as far as Italy's economy and things like that when it worked in a much larger, more sophisticated economy such as the United States.
Okay, let me answer these questions. The dangerous part of Padre, the moral hazard, is the beauty of Padre, of course, is that it's very simple, very easy, no trouble. And if you do it once, why don't you do it twice? And why don't you do it 3 times? So we take it very seriously. I didn't have time to talk about it. There are 2 answers to that. First, the plan preempts this seigniorage income from the ECB. Once you've used it, it's gone. It can't be used twice. The amounts are, depending on the assumptions you make, are sufficient, but not to do it every 2 years or every 10 years. So first, the golden goose cannot be plucked twice. But that's not an answer that's going to impress governments, I'm sure. So the very important part of the Padre plan that I didn't describe is, and that's where I was, it was useful to work with a banker, is we have a covenant. A covenant is an agreement between the agency and the member governments. And the idea of this covenant is to constrain governments individually and governments collectively to do fiscal discipline. So I can't go into detail, but I don't think it's the time to do it. Essentially, these covenants make sure that governments cannot continue to have budget deficits. And if they do, there is a punishment mechanism where, let me just say one word about this punishment mechanism. I told you the agency buys government debt and tell governments forget about this debt. The covenants say if a government violates its commitment to fiscal discipline, the agency has not just the right but the obligation to take a little bit of this debt that's been forgotten, turn it back into a real life debt and put it in the market. And every 6 months they put another drop. So these drops of debts put on the market, you can think as a garrote, slowly, slowly tightening up. And if the government doesn't get it the first time, it will get it the second time because the markets will run. So that's an obligation of the agency. And then there is something about not having governments gang up together and cheat on everything together. So there is also a decision process to change the rule, and it's done in such a way that no government will want ever to change the rule. Now, the end of the discussion is that people look me in the eyes and say, but surely government can cheat in many more ways than you can imagine. And I have to say, yes, there is no ultimately completely safe commitment that you can impose on government. So if you want to be very cynical, you say, oh yes, they'll do that, and 20 years from now they will be so much smarter than you, they will find a way of undermining the whole thing. Yes, maybe. But there is a long effort in this plan to make that as impossible as possible, but never zero, but it's really tilting. Question about fiscal rule. Right, so in the Paris plan we have a fiscal rule, but let me say something. There is this thing which is called the Fiscal Compact, or the TSCG, the Treaty on Stability and Cooperation and Governance of the European Union, that was adopted in 2012. That was done at the request of the president of the ECB. That was before the LTRO. Dear Mario gave an interview and he said, well, you know, I can do things with government bonds, but we need a fiscal compact. What is a fiscal compact? And then it happened. Now, I have a different view of TSCG than the Commission. The Commission sees that as the ultimate, well, as another step to strengthen the Stability Pact. I see this as a change of paradigm. The whole idea of the Stability Pact is that the center, the Commission and governments, tell each national government and parliament what to do. Too big deficits, increase these taxes, reduce this spending. That's the spirit of TSCG. As I said before, it can't work because countries are sovereign. What I have in mind is a decentralized system of fiscal discipline, which I think is what you said, whereby it's the national institutions that force governments to be fiscally disciplined. And the TSCG has, the heart of the TSCG says each country has to put, if possible, in its constitution, a fiscal rule, if possible, of the good kind. And I don't want to go into the details, but there are good fiscal rules. But it's if possible. Now, this was accepted as a treaty, and governments are now putting it in place. I'm told that the Commission will come with a review of what has been done, so I don't have a clear view of what governments have done. But in many countries, it's not in the Constitution, and it's a very soft fiscal rule. So it's a missed opportunity. But it's a step forward in the sense that the idea of decentralizing fiscal discipline down to member governments is now in our treaty. And I hope that there will be a second or a third version to move the discipline efforts back to government level where it belongs because of sovereignty. So that was a good question. Now the question about the banks. What we have seen since the beginning of the crisis is that national banks have bought large amount of their own government public debt. Why did they do that? Well, certainly when you, let me put it the following. I suspect they got phone calls from government officials saying, dear Mr. Banker, buy my debt, please, it's going to help me. And the banker said, yeah, but if buy your debt and you default, I'm doomed. And the answer is, don't worry, I'll always protect you, won't I? So there is this sort of bad relationship between banks and governments where governments are very proud to say, oh, we issued yesterday 500 million of public debt, and the markets bought it. And you ask which markets bought it? It was the National Bank. So it's a very, very unhealthy situation. Now, that's why our politically acceptable plan doesn't hurt the bondholder, not because I like the system, but because if the Italian government defaults, the Italian banks will be dead. And if the Italian banks are dead, then the government must borrow to bail out the banks, because we need banks. So it would serve no good purpose. And that's why I think you have to save them. But it's a very bad idea. I mean, the evolution is a bad idea. We understand why it's happening. Gold reserves. I must say, I haven't thought about computing how much there is. I think there is very little. But I think there is not enough by far, but it's just a guess. So I'll go out and check how big are the gold reserves. There is something else we've been looking in the Padre plan is in the same spirit is governments sell public companies or assets. They have governments have assets, so the Italian government could sell the Coliseum in Rome or whatever. It's very hard to have numbers, but I have seen estimates of that. That's much, much too small. That can help on the margin. Actually, the richest government in the Eurozone is the Italian government in terms of what it owns. So it could sell a part of what it has, but it's not that much. And you don't want it to do what we call fire sales, so brutally sell things quickly because the price will collapse. So it wouldn't work. And selling gold suddenly would also depress the price of gold. I think these are good things that can be done on the side by small amount very slowly. But I think the amounts are very small, I think, for gold. For the public assets, I know. Bailout, somebody said, why does it not work? I think, yeah. Well, it works in the sense that when you are a Greek government and you cannot borrow from markets and you have a budget deficit next month, you have to find money somewhere. So that's why the bailout money is plugging the hole. But the bailout money is an increase in public debt. So you treat a public debt crisis by increasing the public debt. You remember the picture I showed for Greece, this big red bar. It's entirely debt to officials, debt to the IMF, debt to the ESM, EFSF, and bilateral debts to national member governments, which means that if Greece were to default today, it would hurt mostly a little bit of the Greek bank, but mostly the other governments. That's why the other governments don't want to have the Greek default. So a bailout is an emergency band-aid when you're bleeding, but it's making the situation worse in the long run. So it cannot be the only solution. It's an emergency. I'm not against that. I'm in favor of IMF bailouts, not the kind we have, but it's an emergency. It aggravates the situation. So when I hear some European governments say, oh, we've been so nice to the Greeks, we've given them 240 billion. We've given them nothing. We've lent them and we have doubled their debt. And they are in a worse situation now than before. And they pay interest on the debt. Initially, the interest rate was very high. Punishment, it was called. So it's a good business for the German taxpayers to have lent to Greece, not for the Greek taxpayer. I think that was the first round of questions.
Yes. Is there any other questions? In the meantime, I do one of mine. I think you, yeah, my first concern about the plan, I think is related to the first question about, because at some point when you were listening, where you were listing the 7 mistakes, you mentioned no more, no bailout, which means how you enforce fiscal discipline, and it seems to me that also in your plan, it's one of the points is how to enforce that. You discuss covenants, but still there will be down the road some problem of enforcement, but you already replied to that. So the other question is, I very much like you having moved the blame from the IMF to the ECB. But still, when you go back and you started from Greece, you said we start from when market discovered and government and market discovered that the fiscal balance was much worse than expected, then everything, this problem started there. But so probably a cheap shot is what the role of international institutions at that point in time. Why we had to wait for a new government to show them the real numbers, if there is any responsibility international institutions like Europe or even the IMF or other governments, we should provide credible numbers to the markets.
Thank you. I would like to elaborate a bit on your counterfactual, if possible. So, let's assume that the politically acceptable restructuring plan gets accepted, something which I hoped for because I find your idea quite interesting and very well thought. And then we are back with our public deficits halved, and we have, however, to think about how to turn back Europe into growth. So, what can we do? Because we have seen that last data from GDP growth and consumer industrial productions seem to show that the ECB, the Federal Reserve, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, monetary operations aren't exactly financing a sustainable growth. And on the other end, as you said, it would be illogical to halve debt, public debt, and make more debt hereafter. So what do you think we can do to turn Europe back to growth, even if your good scenario is accepted by public policymakers? Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, reply.
Okay, so let me start. Let me start with your questions. So the no bailout. Okay. One of the things that I like in the Padre plan is that it is going a long way into solving the killing of the no bailout clause. The covenant. Okay, so there is a question about whether governments can cheat with the covenants. But the way the covenant works, and that also deals with the last question, is that suppose we do a Padre for Italy and the public debt of Italy is after the debt restructuring, I remember vaguely something like 70%, imagine. Then the covenants say, you Italy, from now on, you are not allowed to have your public debt go above 70%, which is where we took you, plus something to have room to do fiscal policy. And suppose this something is 10%, just an example. So it means that after Italy enters Padre, Italy cannot go above 80%. And if the debt of Italy goes above 80%, when it gets to 81%, then my devilish scheme starts. The agency takes a bit of extinguished public debts and puts it back on the market. Now, that I think will prevent governments from cheating or letting their debts increase to a situation where they need a bailout. And that will eventually allow governments to find a way of reaffirming the no bailout, which is only good if it's credible. So that's the way we deal about that. I've spent literally 2 years or 3 years trying to think about how to restore the no bailout clause once it's been cheated upon, and I have no solution. If anybody can find a solution, I would love it. So the covenant is sort of my response to that. If you believe that it cannot be cheated upon, which I cannot.
Is there any room for discretionary versus exogenous fiscal policy? Because you can imagine, you have like the start of the crisis.
The Italian government is sovereign and they can do whatever they want, but they have signed an agreement that if the public debt goes above 80%, then there is hell that will break loose. some of the previously vanished debt will start reappearing mysteriously on the market, and you know that, and it happens automatically. So if the government doesn't respond to the first incentive, then the next 6 months the debt will go up again, whatever it does, and it will keep going up. At some point, even the most stubborn government would, in my view, should give in. I can't think of anything better, but I know it's not 100% foolproof. Now, wrong numbers, role of international institutions and IMF. Well, the real guilty one in the case of Greece was the Eurostat. And when the Greek government revealed that they had cheated or they didn't give the right information to Eurostat, as you may know, the procedures of Eurostat have been changed. I mean, that the first thing that happened after the Greek crisis is that there was a change in the way Eurostat operates. They sent an army of European statisticians to all ministries in Greece, and they looked at all the pieces of papers to make sure it's over, and now there are stricter reporting guidelines. Again, there is a limit as to what you can do. Countries are sovereign, and they are sovereign in collecting their data, and they are sovereign in transmitting the data. So if you have a government that doesn't collect or doesn't transmit properly the data, there is little you can do. You can send the troops, but I don't think we are going to do that. So at the end of the day, we do depend on countries, and international institutions can only check the data and be extremely suspicious and tell the Greeks in 2009 your numbers don't look right. But as far as you can do, I don't think you can blame. At the end, if people want to cheat, they cheat. I see no solution. Now, your question about growth, I started to answer. I believe that, well, first, monetary policy, you mentioned it. I think the ECB should do much more. They finally brought the interest rate down to 0 last month. It's been at 0 elsewhere in the world for 2 years, so that's one of the things that I think a mistake. Once your interest rates are down to 0, you don't have conventional monetary policy. You can only do the non-standard kind. We don't know how powerful is the non-standard. So one view is that if it can't hurt, if it can't help, it can't hurt, so let's do it. It's more or less the way the Federal Reserve has operated, saying, let's try, we'll see if it does help. The Bank of England has done very interesting things, and as you know, the UK is growing now pretty fast, and my British friends tell me it's largely because of the Bank of England doing non-standard things, encouraging loans to the private sector and so on and so forth. So I think the ECB should move in this direction. They said last month that they were studying these things. I wish they study a bit faster, and I wish they move in this direction. So maybe but certainly they should do that. Now there are a number of people who think that it can hurt. Former ECB chief economist Otmar Issing is all over the place saying these policies create distortions and they can hurt. I think having 12–15% unemployment hurts also very much. And the question is how much risk you're willing to do to reduce the unemployment rate. And personally, I would take risks. Not Otmar Issing. It's a debate. Now, the big thing about Padre is if the Italian public debt goes down to 70% tomorrow morning, a number of things will happen. First, the interest rate in Italy will go down very quickly. That will be an expansionary boost. Number two, I suspect there will be exuberance on the markets. If a magic wand would reduce half of the Italian public debt, I would expect markets, not just in Italy, everywhere in Eurozone, markets to jump. When markets jump, we know this has positive effect for growth. So that would be a big boost of enthusiasm. One reason why we are in a recession is that people are scared. People save because they are scared. If you tell them half of the public debt is gone, people will be pretty optimistic, so I would expect consumption to go up at long last. And finally, the Italian government would recover room for maneuver. if its public debt is 70%, and in my plan it's allowed to go to 80, I think most Italian governments would not go to 80, but they would let go the debt go to 75 very quickly to kickstart the economy. So I think the so to summarize, the ECB should do much more, and if you do Padre, you get an automatic expansionary boost, and you give room for the governments to do some expansionary fiscal policy. At that stage, we should be home with a growing economy.
Okay, thanks a lot. Is there any other question? Okay, so just let me add another one. My take of your presentation is, you talk, it seems that you suggest that all the attention should be on public debt, and that is some sort of vulnerability indicator. So the larger the debt, the more vulnerable you are to a debt default, you are to contagion, you are to the nexus between sovereign banks and firms and real economy. So my question is, which is probably related to the last discussion that came out, is what about the real underlying causes of the crisis? In the sense that you started from Greece, you said it was a debt crisis, and that's so on. But then there was a contagion, there are other crises, and it's not, in my view at least, it's not all about public debt. And given especially that you were also mentioning that some central banks are doing unconventional monetary policy, are doing different things to stimulate the economy, especially household. And I'm also thinking at all the debate in the US about what has been done during managing the crisis, what has been done wrongly or badly, if it's, the bank should have, the central bank, the Fed should have borrowed and lent much more to houses to avoid the crisis in the mortgage sector. So what do you think are the underlying causes, at least the most important things that we have to put in order to minimize that high debt can trigger future crisis in the near future? For sure. Sta arrivando.
Your plan, your suggestion is looking like something good for many actors. It's good for the banks, it's good for the central bank, it's good for almost all the all the main actors. So the question is, what play against the implementation of the plan? Why the plan is not accepted if everybody seems to be happier with it?
Okay. So, Andrea, you asking the question, what is the real underlying cause of the crisis? You didn't say what you thought it was. And I said it was public debt. Of course, it's much short. I think the Maastricht Treaty, or the treaties that created the monetary union, there were a number of things that were missing. First, as I mentioned, there is a recognition that we need fiscal discipline, but we have the wrong concept. The Stability and Growth Pact is the wrong concept. So that's why we entered in the monetary union with, and since then debts have been going up and up and up. Not everywhere, but they have gone up. So we haven't solved that, and we need fiscal discipline in the euro area. In any monetary union you need. So this problem has not been solved correctly. We're going in the right direction with the TSCG, but we are not right there. So that's one reason of the crisis. Second, if you have a central bank, you have to have a real central bank. And a central bank is not just about price stability. It is about price stability, but there are other things that central banks do. One of the things that is now accepted after the financial crisis is central banks are in charge of financial stability. So as you remember, our beloved president of the ECB, Jean-Claude Trichet, used to say the best contribution that the central bank can do to financial stability is to have price stability. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And now it's admitted everywhere, nearly everywhere, that central banks are in charge of financial stability. Now, what does it mean? It means a number of things, but at least it's being recognized, including in the euro area. One of the things it means, but there are two other functions that are related to financial stability, but are very specific functions. Central banks ought to be lender of last resort. They have to be of lender of last resort to banks and to their own government. Now, before the financial crisis, the fashion about central bankers was to say, maybe we'll be lender of last resort, maybe not, we are never going to make a commitment. That's why I wrote somewhere, this fig leaf has fallen. We now know how central banks look like, and they are lenders of last resort. And I think all the reasonable central bankers I know accept it's not something they can choose to do or not to do. They have to be lender of last resort when things go wrong. They have to be lender of last resort to banks, and some people were talking about the US crisis, that was spectacular. Oh, sorry. They have to be lender of last resort to bank, because we've seen with Lehman Brothers you cannot allow systemically important banks to collapse. And they have to be lender of last resort to governments. And why? There is a wonderful paper by Paul de Grauw that asks, why did the debt crisis never spread out of the Eurozone? If you look at the public debt of Japan, it's much, much bigger than Greece. It's now nearly 300% of GDP. The US is getting to 100%. The UK is getting to 100%. Why there has never been the smallest suggestion that these countries could have a debt crisis? And the answer that Paul de Grauw gives is because these countries borrow in their own currency, which what it means is they have their own central banks. So if you ask the market, can there be a default of, say, of US federal debt? And the answer is, of course not. The Federal Reserve Bank will make sure it doesn't happen. They will buy whatever it takes to make sure there is no default on the federal government debt. Same in the UK. The Bank of England has bought huge quantity of Her Majesty's government debt. And there is no doubt they will do that. In the euro area, we had the ECB, which thought that buying public debt was a very bad thing to do. And they refused to do it for a very long time. And that's why the debt crisis has been uniquely European, uniquely within the Eurozone, because there is the perception that the ECB is not a lender of last resort to government. Now, it cannot be a lender of last resort to government in this very extraordinary system called the monetary union, because if the ECB makes losses on, say, the Italian debt, these losses will be shared by all member countries. And since member governments don't want to pay for each other's debt, we cannot have the ECB being lender of last resort. And that's a big problem we have, and that's why we need a no bailout clause or the Padre covenant to make sure that government will never need to be bailed out by the ECB. And there is no shortcut to that. Maybe 5 or 6 generations from now, the Germans will be delighted to help the Greeks, pretty much like the people in Oklahoma are ready to help the people in Nebraska. But right now, we don't have that in the euro area. And that's very deeply, I think, one reason. And there is lending to banks, and I mentioned that in my talk. The ECB could not be a lender of last resort to banks because it didn't know what banks were doing and it didn't have the power to resolve the banks. Now we have the banking union that has made steps in the right direction. The steps are not complete, but we are going in a situation where if there is a failure of an important bank in the euro area, the ECB will probably be able to deal with the problem without having political hell raised on it.
Okay, thanks. Okay, no, you're fine. Thanks.
Oh, your question. Oh, limitation of padre. Why don't? Oh, sorry. Yeah, why don't they buy it? I've spent the last 4 or 5 months of my life as a salesman, going from capital to capital, trying to sell padre. What I am told is, what are you talking about? The crisis is over. There's nothing to be done. It's done. There's no more crisis in Europe, in the Eurozone. So that's what the politicians think. As far as I know, they are nearly unanimous in believing that the debt crisis is over. And politicians never do anything that's difficult unless they have really have to do it. So I think that's the problem we are facing right now. In a way, the situation is too good. Now, the reaction is that, the other reaction is it's complicated. It's new, it's off the beaten tracks, and therefore we won't touch it unless we are forced to do it. So that's what's happening.
Okay, thanks a lot again to Charles Wyplosz for the lecture. Let me just thank again the staff for the nice hospitality to a very nice building, and the Fondazione Merloni for the continuous support to Economia Marche and for making it possible to organize this lecture and hopefully a number of other lectures in the future. Thanks again. Bye.